Hey everyone, welcome to our second bonus episode for the Bible in Context on the Gospel of Thomas. Last time we talked a little bit about what the Gospel of Thomas is. We talked about what language it's in. We talked about some of the assumptions in a lot of Thomasine scholarship when it comes to dating the book or trying to figure out where it comes from, how important it is. And we talked about why some of those assumptions aren't the greatest. And so we're going to this time talk about some not new, but we're going to reevaluate some of those assumptions and try to get some better ones based on the work of Simon Gathercole in his book, The Composition of the Gospel of Thomas. Now, probably sounds kind of boring, and I will say this episode is going to be a little more technical, but I wanted to do this episode so that we really can understand the nuts and bolts of the thinking behind the dating and importance of the Gospel of Thomas that I'm putting forward in this podcast and that Gathercole is putting forward in his book. Now, when I do say that it's going to be technical, I'm not going to be going through the Coptic text or anything like that. It's going to be very understandable, but it's going to dive a little deeper into some text-critical issues than what we normally do on this, and really more than what normal people consider fun. So some of you might find this interesting, and you're one of those not normal people. Cool. But either way, I hope that you hang out, and I hope that this is interesting. I hope it's helpful, and that if you like the Gospel of Thomas, this is helpful to you to understand its level of importance, especially in relation to the Synoptic Gospels. And one more thing that I want to repeat from the last episode before we dive into some of these text-critical issues is that we did talk about, too, some of the ideas that are present in the Gospel of Thomas and some of the ideas that are assumed to be in the Gospel of Thomas, at least among a popular audience that are reading Thomas often for Gnostic ideas or Gnostic interpretation, which, again, I need to say that the Gospel of Thomas is not a Gnostic text, but it does have some things that resonate with Gnostic ideas, especially if you misinterpret a lot of the phrases in the passage. And again, just for instance, to remind us what this means, a lot of Gnostic ideas are about looking inward and having some kind of inner knowledge about yourself that give you kind of the interpretive or salvific keys, if you will. And just for instance, there is a phrase in the Gospel of Thomas where Jesus says, "Know what is in front of you, and what is hidden will be revealed." Well, you can take that statement in a very Gnostic direction if you would like to, but the correct interpretation is who's speaking to the disciples here. Jesus is the one speaking. Know what is in front of you. Well, Jesus is what's in front of you. Know Jesus, and what is hidden will be revealed. That starts to sound fairly biblical, actually. So there are some things where if you know the culture, you understand the literary setting, a lot of the bad things that come out of Thomas just kind of go away, and it starts to sound a little bit orthodox. But don't get me wrong, there are some things in Thomas that are very Platonic and pre-Gnostic, so I'm not going to go and advocate that it's a good book that we should learn from necessarily, although it may be interesting. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive into a little bit of this text-critical thinking that we have to do to understand the Gospel of Thomas a little better and where it stands with the other Gospels. The first thing we need to talk about is what is called Markan priority. Now, that is not a word or a phrase that you have to remember. All that means is that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all share a lot of phrases with one another. And scholars almost unanimously agree that Matthew and Luke are working together a little bit as they write their Gospels. And they are both taking material from Mark and then adding in their own stuff, and then also perhaps using other traditions that they have gathered from other witnesses or, who knows. But they're borrowing from Mark, they're working together, so there's a lot of overlap between their stories, and they're also adding in other material from other sources about Jesus' life and ministry. So, let me just repeat that. The scholarly consensus is with the books of Mark, Matthew, and Luke that Mark was written first, and then Matthew and Luke will take material from Mark, and they will put it into their gospel narratives, perhaps tweaking it a little bit to fit the immediate literary context or literary structures that they're trying to create in their particular narrative. This taking of a text and editing it and putting it into another document is what a lot of scholars will refer to as redacting. They're redacting Mark. Again, not a word you have to remember, but Matthew and Luke redact Mark. So Mark came first, and Matthew and Luke came somewhere around the same time working together. Now, again, this shouldn't really be a scary thing. We know, I mentioned last episode, that biblical books will take material from previous biblical books, often to expound upon the interpretation or the ideas found there. In this case, they are using what they know about Jesus from Mark and whatever other sources they're relying on to tell a coherent story from a new angle about Jesus and who he is, what he does, who we are in relation to him and his ministry. So the fact that they are borrowing from one another, that shouldn't be a scary thing. It's not malicious. It's just the way the Bible has always worked. It's a very human and divine book. We talked about that a lot in our very first episode. So again, that shouldn't be scary. Now, why am I telling you this? Why am I telling you that Mark came first and then Matthew and Luke? Well, that's kind of what we need to know in order to figure out whenever Thomas borrows from the Gospels, or let's just say, whenever Thomas has language that is shared with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, who came first? Well, here's what happens. We can take a look at the way Mark says something, and then we can tell that Matthew and Luke took it and changed it a little bit. And then we can look at Thomas and see, okay, did he take something from Mark and change it, or did he take something from Matthew and Luke that came from Mark and then change it further? That way we can see the direction of flow of changes. Depending on the way that words are changed, which words are changed, which ones are carried over from Mark, which ones are carried from Matthew, which ones are carried from Luke, we're able to tell, okay, we can tell there's a flow of redaction here. There's a flow of modification of the text. So does it look like Thomas is at the beginning of that flow before Mark? Is he in the middle of that flow between Mark and Matthew and Luke? Or is he at the end of that flow after Mark, Matthew, and Luke? And we're going to get into a couple examples of this and show you exactly how this works. Well, before we talk about the relationship of the Gospel of Thomas with the Synoptics, I just want to point out again that there's not really a lot known about the Gospel of Thomas. We just have a Coptic text, a partial Greek text, both of which were found in Egypt, and those texts themselves come from about 100 to 200 years from the time that the actual book was written. So we also have a handful of references to the Gospel of Thomas outside of the Gospel of Thomas itself, and it's mainly from church fathers, and it's mainly negative assessments of the book. It was not well received when it was first put out. It was fairly widely distributed, not as much as the canonical books, but still, for what it was fairly widely circulated, and circulated enough that some church fathers felt the need to write about it and just tell us how much they didn't like it. A lot of these references to the Gospel of Thomas came 100 years plus after the book was written, so we don't have anything from before the 3rd century talking about the Gospel of Thomas, but again, a lot of these references to the Gospel of Thomas are negative. Sometimes they are misattributions to different heretical groups. We have some text attributing the Gospel of Thomas to a group of Hippocrates' disciples. We have some other text attributing it to the Manichaeans, which neither of these is actually correct, but still, the point being, it was not well received or respected by mainstream Christianity when it was written. So let's go ahead and get into Gathercole's work of showing where this gospel came from, at least when it comes to its source material in the Synoptics. So first thing I just want to say, why use Gathercole's work? What sets him apart from other people who have attempted to do scholarship on the Gospel of Thomas and show how it uses or is even a source for other canonical material? Well, the first thing that is really nice about Gathercole's work is he surveys the field for Thomasine scholarship and trends in that scholarship. He takes a look at the assumptions made, the different dates and ideas and influences proposed on the book. So he has a finger on a wide range of methodologies about the book and how they compete, and he's able to think critically about what is the best existing methodology to move forward with, or how should it be modified in order to get better ideas as we go forward. So he takes that, he applies a very stringent methodology that we're going to talk about here in just a second when it comes to evaluating the relationship between the Synoptic Gospels and the Gospel of Thomas. Now, something else I like about what he does is, and you'll see, I feel like this is becoming more popular in scholarship, and it should be, but older works I feel like you'll read and there'll be some more conjecture. Whenever there's something that we just can't know, he is very keen to say, we just don't know it. He will sometimes say, I think X, Y, or Z may have happened, but I like to see whenever a scholar can just admit that we don't know something, we don't have the evidence for it, and not try to put out some kind of conjecture based on what they feel should be correct. And perhaps most importantly, he's received pretty good reviews from others in this field. After reading some of the reviews, it seems like his work has been widely accepted and his methodology is pretty rigorous. So that's always good news to know that others in the field like his work. So that's a good starting place. All right, so what does he do? Now, out of the 114 sayings in the Gospel of Thomas, there are 67 sayings that share significant amounts of language with the Synoptic Gospels. But we're not going to be using all 67 of those sayings, and I'm also not going to walk you through all 67 of those. I'll spare you that. You don't have to just listen to me drone on about all those sayings, but we're going to take a few examples. So which ones are we going to use if we're not going to use all 67? Well, we can't use all 67 instances of shared language with Matthew, Mark, or Luke because we need to use the sayings that are shared between Matthew, Mark, and Thomas, or Luke, Mark, and Thomas, so that we can tell the direction of the redaction, like I mentioned a minute ago. If we see that Mark and Thomas have some similar language, well, that's great, but just based on that, we can't tell who borrowed from who. We have to see the text go from Mark to Matthew, and then see how Thomas uses it to see, like, okay, he redacted this text after Matthew used it. He took it after Matthew had already used it, or Luke. So that's why we have to have shared language between at least 3 of these books. And just to try to say this in another way to help us understand it before we get into it, these changes in the text, these redactions, these copies and edits, they kind of stack up in the text like layers. As someone else copies and changes the text a little bit, it's like a new layer. So we're doing some textual archaeology here. We're trying to peel back the layers, and through that we can see the order that the layers were laid down. So the one on the bottom is first, the one in the middle came second, and the one on top was the last one written. So maybe you can think of it that way if it helps. This is kind of like peeling back layers and doing some textual archaeology. Now, the last couple things that I want to say before we actually dig into these redactional layers is that Matthew actually gets a mention in the Gospel of Thomas. In saying 13, Jesus said to his disciples, "Compare me to someone and tell me whom I am like." Simon Peter said to him, "You are like a righteous angel." And Matthew said to him, "You are like a wise philosopher." Thomas said to him, "Master, my mouth is wholly incapable of saying whom you are like." Now, in this little section, yes, Jesus is saying, compare me to somebody, tell me who I am like. And we're supposed to see Matthew and Peter as giving not so great answers, but Thomas, he's the hero. He gives this answer that Jesus is unlike anything that he can describe. And after this, Thomas is kind of taken to the side, and he's given some kind of secret knowledge that when he comes back, the disciples ask him, "What did he tell you?" And he says, "If I tell you, you'll stone me." So it's some kind of magnificent knowledge that would almost sound heretical to everybody else. So, setting that aside, why does the Gospel of Thomas use Peter and Matthew to portray the poor responses about who Jesus is like? Well, there's been some thoughts about that in Thomasine scholarship. Peter has a reputation as the establishment or as mainstream Christianity. So, for those who are trying to break away from the mainstream Christian thought, Peter is kind of an easy target. It's easy to take him and make him the kind of a bad guy, or make him look like a fool in your text, to kind of take shots at mainstream Christianity. And now I'm not talking about the Pope, which came way later. I'm not talking about later Catholicism. I'm talking about in the early church, in the first couple hundred years, he had a reputation of representing the establishment of Christianity, the mainstream Christianity. Okay, so what about Matthew? This is the one we really care about anyway. So Matthew was already known at the time as a gospel writer. Now what's interesting about that is the Gospel of Matthew is actually an anonymous work. It never says that Matthew wrote it. It's anonymous. But there was a guy named Papias of Hierapolis living from the 1st to 2nd century AD, and he claims that the Gospel of Matthew was written by the Apostle Matthew. Now, not all of Papias's information is necessarily correct, but it does show that Matthew has a reputation as a gospel writer at this time, and from what we can tell, that is the only reputation that Matthew had at this time. And so the fact that the Gospel of Thomas mentions Matthew very likely is a reference to Matthew, the gospel writer. So that means this is very likely a reference to the Gospel of Matthew, meaning that the Gospel of Matthew predates the Gospel of Thomas. He's trying to take shots at the writer of the Gospel of Matthew. So again, that's just another pointer to the fact that the Gospel of Thomas very likely came after the books of Matthew and Luke. And I haven't said this yet, so let me just throw this out there. I forgot to mention it earlier that the Gospels of Matthew and Luke were written in the mid to late 1st century AD. So just so that you know that, right around like the 70s or 80s AD, that's where we're looking for Matthew and Luke to have been written. Okay, so let's dive into some of these Gospel of Thomas redactions of Matthew and Luke, some of these borrowing and changing of texts that happens from Mark to Matthew to Thomas, or from Mark to Luke to Thomas. And the first one we're going to look at is the parable of the wicked tenants. And that is going to be in the Gospel of Thomas, it's saying 65 through 66. In Luke, it's going to be chapters 29 through 17, and then we also find this parable in Mark 12, 1 through 11, and Matthew 21, 33 through 42. So we've got this represented in all 4 of these texts. Now, I'm sure if you're listening to this, you probably have pretty easy access to listen to those or read those portions out of the Synoptic Gospels, out of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I'm going to go ahead and read the Gospel of Thomas 65 through 66. It's pretty easy to look up a translation of the Gospel of Thomas, but likely less people have read that than they have the Synoptics. So I'll just read that to, first of all, remind us of the parable of the wicked tenants, and just to hear the Gospel of Thomas version before we start to pull it apart and compare it to the Synoptic Gospels. I'm not going to read all of it. I don't think I should spend time reading all 4 of these accounts on this podcast, but I'm going to go ahead and read the Gospel of Thomas. So, a usurer owned a vineyard. He leased it to tenant farmers so that they might work it and he might collect the produce from them. He sent his servants so that the tenants might give him the produce of the vineyard. They seized his servant and beat him, all but killing him. The servant went back and told his master. His master said, "Perhaps he did not recognize them." He sent another servant. The tenants beat this one as well. The owner then sent his son and said, "Perhaps they will respect my son." When those tenants realized that it was he who had sent the heir to the vineyard, they seized him and killed him. Let him who has ears hear. Then it moves on to the Gospel of Thomas saying 66, and it just says, Jesus said, "Show me the stone which the builders rejected. It is the cornerstone." Now, that should sound pretty familiar. If you recognize the story from the Gospels, it sounds pretty similar, at least in its basic construction. But we're going to see here that there are some things that link the Gospel of Thomas to Luke more closely than it does to Mark. And that's ultimately going to bring us to ask the question, who came first, the Gospel of Thomas or Luke? Well, before we get there, let's start off with just pointing out some of the similarities with the Gospel of Thomas and Luke that the Gospel of Thomas and Matthew and Mark do not share. Well, first of all, the passage opens with a link to Isaiah 5 and 7 in Matthew and Luke. Jesus starts the parable out by speaking about the owner building a fence and a wine press, and those elements are words that are taken out of Isaiah 5, 1 through 7. Pretty much all commentators on those Gospels will recognize those links back to Isaiah. Now, the Gospel of Thomas and Luke, they omit those features. So, they both together decide to drop that. And so that could have been an independent decision where they each decided to drop those exact features, or somebody dropped them first and then the next person copied those dropped features, or at least followed suit and copied the story without those features in there. Now, we also have in the Gospel of Thomas and Luke, it says that the farmer leased out the land so that the tenants may give the produce. Matthew and Mark says so that the servants may collect the produce for the farmer. And so there's just a little shift in the verb there. In the Gospel of Thomas and Luke, the tenants are going to give the produce. In Mark and Matthew, the servants go and collect the produce. Now, also we have Thomas and Luke, the servants are beaten and sent back. In Matthew and Mark, the servants are killed. In Thomas and Luke, they both contain the word perhaps. And those words only occur in those locations in Thomas and Luke. It doesn't appear anywhere else in either of those books. And so the fact that they decided to use the exact same rare word in the exact same place is very suspect. It seems like they're working together, or someone copied from somebody. Now, Thomas and Luke, they also omit a reference to Psalm 18:23. We have at the end there, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. That's Psalm 18, verse 22. Matthew and Mark, they continue that quote on into verse 23, Psalms 118:23, whereas Thomas and Luke omit verse 23. So they both decide to cut out the same portion of that psalm. Thomas and Luke, they also refer to fruit in the singular, whereas Matthew and Mark refer to it in the plural. That's not as large of a point, but it's just interesting that they share the same grammatical construction on top of all these other elements. Thomas and Luke also talk about beating the servants, whereas Mark, he inserts this little thing about beating the servants over the head. So Luke drops that, and then the Gospel of Thomas also drops it. So we see that the Gospel of Thomas is more akin to Luke than it is to Mark or Matthew. So, who came first? Mark, Luke, or Thomas? Well, we've already talked about, we know the fact that Mark has come before Luke. So where does Thomas fit in? Let's start with that Isaiah 5 reference, because this exact same thing is going to happen throughout Gathercole's work. Just imagine that the Gospel of Thomas came before Mark. So the Gospel of Thomas does not include a reference to Isaiah 5. Then Mark adds that back in. And then Luke, unaware of the Gospel of Thomas, as he is copying from Mark, decides to remove that exact same passage that Mark had added and that the Gospel of Thomas did not include. It seems very unlikely that the Gospel of Thomas would leave something out, Mark would add it back in, and then Luke would then be the next one in line and change it back, correct it back to be like Thomas when he does not have knowledge of Thomas. And we can tell based on the shape of Luke's stories that his source is Mark. He's not incorporating the Gospel of Thomas versions. As you go through and read the Gospel of Thomas, you'll see, okay, these stories sound similar, but Luke's versions very clearly come from Mark and not from Thomas's altered versions, because Thomas's versions, they alter it to a whole new level where it is the same, but if you're looking on a grammatical and word scale, they're very different. So Thomas is not the source for Luke. So in this, it very clearly seems that Mark came first, and then Luke and Thomas had to come after that, rather than Thomas being before Mark. Also, because of some of the other dating factors we've talked about, we have fair certainty about that because Mark was so early, probably in the 50s AD. And we've already talked about how even the scholars that think Thomas came first, they think that it was kind of a rolling corpus where there's kind of sections of sayings all put together and added to later. So there's some parts of it that are very early and some that are late. So either way, the material of the Gospel of Thomas would not have existed in its final form at this period regardless. So Luke is copying from Mark. Now let's talk about the reference to Psalm 118. The phrase is typically, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Well, here's Thomas's version of that again. Jesus said, "Show me the stone which the builders rejected. It is the cornerstone." Now, Thomas changes this psalm even farther. Well, really, the Gospels, they just pretty much copy this out of the Septuagint and put it into their Gospels. But Thomas, whenever he copies it down, he changes it further than either of them, suggesting that he is further from the source of the Psalms. And obviously, the Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, are not copying from Thomas when it comes to the structure of this verse. Thomas seems to be a later redaction of this Psalm 118 quote in the Synoptic Gospels. So that's suggesting that the Gospel of Thomas came after Luke. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we also have quotes from the tenants conspiring together to kill the firstborn, or the son of the farmer, whenever they see him. The Gospel of Thomas leaves those quotes out. The tenants never speak and never conspire to kill him. So again, that seems like a further shift away from the source material of the Gospels, showing that the Gospel of Thomas probably took the material from Mark and Luke and changed it further. He is the later redaction. And I think there's something else that's interesting about the fact that he leaves out the quotes from the tenants. This quote from the tenants typologically links this story back to Joseph. They see Joseph, the one who's been chosen as the firstborn, as the leader of the family, and his brothers see him far off, and they say, "This is the heir, let's kill him. This is the favored brother, let's kill him." And they start talking and conspiring among themselves. So that is what this scene is trying to recall whenever the tenants say, "Look, it's the heir, let's kill him." So the Synoptic Gospels are trying to maintain some typological continuity with the Old Testament in this parable. And Thomas removes himself from that. So he removes himself further from the interpretive Old Testament framework that this parable takes its form from in each of the Synoptic Gospels. So it seems as well that Thomas also did not understand the context and significance of this parable to begin with. And he co-opted it for his own uses, or at least simplified it, and took a lot of the depth out of it when he copied it. So I hope all that makes sense. I want to walk through one more, but I just want to point out that this kind of stuff, if we're just looking at one instance, you might say, okay, that sounds kind of convincing for this particular passage, but that doesn't convince me that the whole book is later than Luke or Matthew. Maybe this is just one coincidental case. Well, you stack up all of his arguments, and again, he goes through 20-some sayings and shows how this works, and how it's consistently pointing to the fact that Matthew and Luke redacted Mark, and then the Gospel of Thomas redacted Matthew and Luke, and perhaps Mark as well. All that evidence stacks up and shows, okay, the Gospel of Thomas seems pretty clearly after Luke and Matthew. So I just want to go through one more just to show how this works somewhere else. And so we will look at the Gospel of Thomas saying 33, 2-3, and how it uses Luke 11:33. This is the saying about a lamp on its lampstand. You don't hide it, you let its light shine. I'm sure everyone's familiar with that, even in a popular context. This saying is also found in Luke 8:16 as well as Luke 11:33. It's found in Matthew 5:15 and in Mark 4:21. Again, I'll go ahead and read the Gospel of Thomas version. So this is saying 33 verses 2-3. And the differences are pretty nuanced, and I'm going to talk about them a little bit, but you'll still understand. You'll hear the story and know exactly what it is. So it says, "For no one lights a lamp and puts it under a bushel, or puts it in a hidden place. No, but he puts it on a lampstand, so that all who go in and come out will see its light." Okay, so again, hopefully you recognize that. Let's talk a little bit about the differences. So in Mark's Gospel, he personifies the lamp. He says that a lamp does not come in order to be put under a bushel. So you can see there, he personifies the lamp. Matthew, Mark, and Luke did not do that. And this shows that the Gospel of Thomas is more closely linked to Matthew and Luke. We're going to see it's actually Luke that it's more linked to when compared to the Gospel of Mark. Now, there are a couple other things in this passage that further link the Gospel of Thomas to the Luke version here, especially Luke 11:33 instead of Luke 8:16. But really, I want to look at one particular statement in these verses that is very telling. So at the end of this saying, it says, those who go in and come out may see the light. Well, that word translated, those who come in, Luke uses, and I'm sorry for the grammar jargon, but a substantive plural participle. Well, okay, so what? Well, that particular form of this word only appears in Luke 8:16, Luke 11:33, which are both of these lamp passages, and in Acts 3:2 and Acts 28:30. So this seems to be, in the New Testament, a Luke word, pretty much. This is a word that only Luke is going to use throughout the New Testament. Now, what's interesting is this exact same verbal form is found in the version of the Gospel of Thomas. So again, that shows that the Gospel of Thomas and Luke are linked here. Because where else is he going to find this word and use it, especially since it's not really used anywhere else in the Gospel of Thomas? It seems like he directly got this from Luke. Now, what's extra significant about this is that Luke's version, it says, those who come in. Thomas expands this and says, all those who go in and come out, with that same word in that phrase, but he expands the phrase. Well, okay, so what? Luke could have taken that phrase and cut it off. Well, here's the thing. Luke uses this phrase, and only Luke uses this in the New Testament, and he uses it a particular way in various places. The fact that he uses it only this way, and it Thomas has a longer phrase, it suggests that what Thomas has done is he has taken this phrase from Luke and redacted it and expanded it. He has borrowed it and edited it for his own purposes, rather than Luke taking this word from Thomas and consistently using it with no variation or no inclusion of Thomas's other language. So again, this is very suggestive that Thomas came after Luke. Thomas is using Luke as a source. Now again, I've only given you 2 examples. I'm just trying to show you how the logic works and how we compare the words and phrases in these Gospels to see who came first and who came last and who came in the middle. We see who the Gospel of Thomas is more like. Is the Gospel of Thomas more akin to Matthew, Mark, or Luke in this instance? In the ones we looked at, he was more akin to Luke. And so, okay, since Luke and Thomas are more similar here, Mark still probably came first. But since we know that Mark came before Luke, we can look and compare Luke and Thomas and see who seems to be further away from the source, who is using special language, who is expanding special language that is only used in the Synoptic Gospels, and those factors, among others, that are explored throughout the book, will suggest to us who is later and who came first. Now, Gathercole's conclusion is that Thomas was written somewhere in the middle of the 2nd century AD, so sometime in the 100s AD. And this is based on the fact that Matthew and Luke, they're dated to the 70s and 80s. There had to be time for these books to be written and then circulated widely enough for Thomas to get a hold of them. And then we also have the factors that by this point Matthew has a reputation as a gospel author and is very likely referenced as a gospel author in the Gospel of Thomas. And then we also have Thomas's affinity for Valentinian Gnosticism, which is a 2nd century, that 100s AD area idea. So this puts him roughly in the anywhere from the early to late, likely just in the middle of the 2nd century AD. Now, we've talked about the fact, too, that that's just a little bit later than the other canonical books. So that doesn't necessarily have to make or break Thomas. I think it is suggestive that Thomas has less reliable resources, less eyewitnesses, which that was very important in the ancient world, is to have eyewitnesses versus having secondhand written documents. Thomas's sources are all secondhand written documents, whereas Luke and the other Gospels, they're getting their information directly from eyewitnesses of Jesus. That was considered a good historical standard when it comes to writing historical documents back in that day. So again, the date itself doesn't make or break Thomas, but it makes it very unlikely that Thomas is talking to eyewitnesses about Jesus. He's using secondhand written sources, and that makes his work a little bit suspect, at least by that culture's standards. And then we've also already discussed in the first bonus podcast on the Gospel of Thomas how he is incorporating Platonic ideas and Valentinian Gnosticism, which are not found in any of the New Testament canon, and more importantly, I think we can say that it's not found in the Old Testament, which I think is even more significant because the New Testament is fulfillment and application of the Old Testament in different cultural settings. So really, this has been shown really well by people like G.K. Beale and those who contributed to his volume, The Old Testament Use of the New Testament. Everything in the New Testament comes from the Old Testament. It's all commentary on, application of, or fulfillment of the Old Testament. If you were finding ideas in the New Testament that can be found nowhere in the Old Testament, you should really question your interpretation, because chances are it's probably off. Now, if Thomas is incorporating all these new ideas and we can't find it in the Old Testament, there's no precedent for it, no interpretive or typological interpretation in the Old Testament, well, chances are it should be called into question. So, the Gospel of Thomas ultimately has a late date, likely no eyewitnesses in its Gospel. It has some teachings from errant theologies that cannot be found in the Old Testament. And we've already talked about the fact, too, that a lot of its sayings are just taken out of context and dropped into the book like a list. So we don't really have a lot of narrative context to interpret a lot of the sayings, especially ones that really need context to be interpreted well, which is seen by the fact that we need the context in Matthew, Mark, and Luke to get a proper interpretation of those parables and sayings in those contexts. So, what do we do with the Gospel of Thomas? Do we care about the Gospel of Thomas? Should we read it? Well, It's kind of interesting if you're studying early Christian ideas and different groups that are cropping up and different ideas that are becoming present in Christians, especially those who are breaking off from mainstream Christianity. I think that's pretty clear. Is this anything that you should base your life around and learn from? No, I don't really think so. Ultimately, when it comes to authority and actually having any really good information about Jesus, well, it's just not that helpful because it's too late and there's no context to tell us what's actually going on, and if the sayings that he's saying are correct, or if there's a context that are giving them a different spin than what we might assume as 21st century people. And some of the sayings that we can interpret seem to contradict the typological themes and theological themes that run throughout all of Scripture. So maybe we need to do a couple episodes at some point on, can we trust what we see in Scripture? Has the Bible been changed? Because often those who like the Gospel of Thomas like to talk about how they think the Gospels and the letters of Paul, really the whole New Testament and the Old Testament, have been changed and even scrubbed of entire theological ideas, yet somehow knit back together as literary and theological wholes that really make a lot of coherent sense as a unified text, which is something next to impossible to do. But all the same, I think I'll just wrap this up and say we can trust our Bibles. We can talk about why later at some point, but we can't really trust Thomas. So, sorry about that, but if you liked the Gospel of Thomas, but I hope that you'll take this and learn from it and try to understand Jesus, not through the Gospel of Thomas, but understand him through the Gospels. He's not trying to teach us a hidden inward secret knowledge, but he is the light that has come and preached his word and made himself known so that we can have life, not in knowledge, but have life in him. It doesn't take secret revelation, but just to know who Christ is through his word and to trust and be loyal to him as our king, as he builds his new kingdom, his people, and we await his return. So, thanks for listening. Again, hope this was helpful.